She's just a girl playing soldier anyway." The words cut through the cafeteria noise like a blade. Recruit Jackson's voice carried that particular brand of arrogance reserved for 22-year-old men who'd never faced real consequences. The timestamp on camera 7 read 14:27:33 when everything changed. Staff Sergeant Kelly Martinez felt the snap before she heard the laughter. 4 sets of hands. 4 phones recording. One moment of violation that would unravel a conspiracy 6 months in the making. 3 cameras, 17 victims, 0 way out. The promise hung in the air like smoke from a discharged weapon. But Kelly Martinez wasn't just another victim. She was a systems specialist with 8 years of military service and access to every security feed on Fort Braxton. What the recruits didn't know would destroy them. What her commanding officers didn't know would destroy them too. Orders don't cover honor. And honor was about to demand its due. The cafeteria at Fort Braxton buzzed with the controlled chaos of 1,200 personnel grabbing lunch between training rotations. Kelly had chosen Table 14 deliberately. Clear sight lines to all exits, back to the wall, within range of 3 different camera arrays. Old habits from deployment days, when situational awareness meant the difference between coming home and coming home in a box. She was reviewing duty rosters on her tablet when they approached. Recruits Jackson, Miller, Thompson, and Davis, the self-appointed kings of Bravo Company's newest intake. 22 to 24 years old, fresh from basic training, and drunk on the kind of power that came from wearing a uniform without understanding what it meant. "Look what we have here," Jackson announced, loud enough for surrounding tables to hear. "Staff Sergeant Martinez, the Ice Queen herself." Kelly's fingers never paused on the tablet screen. 8 years of service had taught her to recognize predators in uniform. These 4 had been circling for weeks, testing boundaries, pushing limits, seeing how far they could go with the base's only female NCO in their chain of command. "Can I help you with something, recruit?" Her voice carried the flat authority of someone who'd earned her stripes the hard way. Miller stepped closer, his bulk casting a shadow over her table. "We were just wondering if you needed any help with those heavy-duty rosters. Wouldn't want you to strain yourself." The laughter that followed had an edge to it. Phones appeared in peripheral vision, recording devices aimed with the casual cruelty of a generation raised on viral humiliation. "I'm fine, thank you." Kelly's tone remained professional. Camera 7 was 18 feet away, angle optimal for facial recognition. Camera 12 had audio pickup from her position. Camera 3 would catch any physical contact from behind. She knew this because she'd designed the coverage patterns herself. "Come on, Sergeant," Thompson chimed in, moving to flank her left side. "We're just being friendly. Right, guys?" Davis completed the circle, positioning himself directly behind her chair. "Super friendly." The trap was set with military precision. 4 angles of approach, multiple recording devices, enough witnesses to ensure maximum humiliation. They'd done this before. Kelly could read it in their coordinated movements, their practiced timing. What they couldn't read was the slight adjustment of her posture, the way her left hand moved to rest near her service radio, the micro-expression that crossed her face as she calculated distances and response times. "You know what I think?" Jackson leaned forward, his voice dropping to a stage whisper that carried to every nearby table. "I think the Ice Queen needs to learn how to have a little fun." The attack came from behind. Davis's hands shot forward, fingers hooking under the strap of her tactical bra, visible through her uniform shirt. The sharp snap echoed like a gunshot in the suddenly quiet cafeteria. "Gotcha!" Miller shouted, his phone capturing Kelly's face as she shot to her feet. The violation lasted exactly 3 seconds. The humiliation was designed to last forever, recorded in high definition for social media distribution. But they'd made one critical error in their calculations. They'd forgotten that Staff Sergeant Kelly Martinez was the soldier who'd survived an IED blast in Afghanistan by staying calm under pressure. The NCO who'd talked down a suicidal private in the middle of a mental health crisis. The systems specialist who'd caught 3 different security breaches by noticing patterns others missed. And they'd forgotten that she wasn't just a victim. She was a predator in her own right, one who'd been hunting much bigger game than 4 overgrown bullies. "Stand down, recruits!" Her voice cut through their laughter like command authority given flesh. "All of you, now!" The steel in her tone made them hesitate. For a moment, the power dynamic shifted. For a moment, they remembered that stripes meant something in the United States Army. Then Jackson's arrogance reasserted itself. "Or what, Sergeant? You gonna cry to the Colonel?" The phones kept recording. The witnesses kept watching. And Kelly Martinez made a decision that would tear Fort Braxton apart from the inside out. "Actually," she said, her voice carrying a coldness that made the nearest soldiers take a step back, "I think I will." She turned and walked away, leaving 4 recruits laughing behind her and a cafeteria full of witnesses who'd just seen something they wished they hadn't. Her stride was measured, professional, giving no hint of the fury building in her chest like a reactor approaching critical mass. But Camera 7 had captured everything. Camera 12 had recorded every word, and Camera 3 had documented the precise timestamp when 4 young men had crossed a line they couldn't uncross. 14/27/33. The moment their lives began to unravel. Thanks for joining this investigation into military justice. What happens next will shock you to your core. If you're ready to see how one woman's refusal to stay silent brought down an entire conspiracy, smash that like button and subscribe for more stories of courage against corruption. Hit that thanks button too. Your support helps us tell these important stories. Quick question while we dive deeper. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment and let me know what country you're tuning in from. I'm always amazed by our global community of justice seekers. Kelly's office was a shrine to 8 years of military precision. Awards lined one wall, commendations for service in Afghanistan, expert marksman badges, certificates from advanced technical training programs. Her desk faced the door, positioned so she could see anyone approaching down the corridor. 2 monitors displayed security feeds from around the base, a privilege that came with her role as Fort Braxton's primary systems coordinator. She was the only person on base, besides the commanding officers, who had access to all surveillance data. It was a responsibility that came with absolute trust and absolute vulnerability. The irony wasn't lost on her as she pulled up the footage from 14/27/33. 3 camera angles, high-definition video, crystal clear audio. The violation played out in excruciating detail, each frame a piece of evidence that should have been sufficient to end 4 military careers before they'd properly begun. But Kelly had learned something important during her 8 years in uniform. Evidence only mattered if the people in power cared about justice. And justice, she'd discovered, was often a luxury that military institutions couldn't afford when careers and reputations were at stake. She saved the footage to an encrypted drive, labeled it with case numbers that corresponded to military regulations governing sexual harassment and assault. Then she did something that would have surprised the 4 recruits still celebrating their victory in the cafeteria below. She smiled. The knock on her door came precisely 30 minutes after the incident. Kelly had been expecting it. Word traveled fast in a military community, especially when it involved the kind of public humiliation that made for good gossip. Enter. Major Sarah Collins stepped through the doorway with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent 22 years perfecting the art of military bearing. At 45, she was everything Kelly aspired to become. Decorated, respected, uncompromising in her pursuit of excellence. Her silver oak leaves caught the light as she closed the door behind her. Staff Sergeant Martinez. Collins's voice carried the warmth that had made her legendary among junior officers. I heard there was an incident in the cafeteria. Kelly stood, snapping to attention with reflexive precision. Yes, ma'am. I was planning to file a formal report this afternoon. At ease. Collins moved to the guest chair, her expression shifting from official concern to something more personal. Kelly, you know I've been watching your career for 3 years. You're one of the finest NCOs I've ever worked with. What happened today is completely unacceptable. The use of her first name wasn't lost on Kelly. Major Collins had been her mentor since arriving at Fort Braxton, the senior female officer who'd guided her through the invisible minefields that came with serving in a male-dominated environment. Collins understood the unique challenges of being a woman in uniform because she'd faced them herself. Thank you, ma'am. I have video evidence of the entire incident. Multiple angles, clear audio, positive identification of all 4 perpetrators. Collins nodded, but something flickered across her expression. Too quick to identify, too subtle to interpret. That's exactly what I wanted to discuss. Kelly, I'm going to be completely honest with you. This base has been under scrutiny lately. The Inspector General's office has been asking questions about our command climate, our handling of interpersonal conflicts. Kelly felt something cold settle in her stomach. Ma'am, Colonel Harrison is under enormous pressure right now. His promotion to full bird colonel is pending, and any scandal could derail 25 years of exemplary service. Collins leaned forward, her voice dropping to the tone of a trusted advisor. I'm not saying what happened was acceptable. I'm saying we need to handle this carefully. The words hung in the air like an undetonated explosive. Kelly had heard variations of this speech before, from other commanders, in other units, when inconvenient truths threatened convenient careers. What are you suggesting, ma'am? I'm suggesting that we use this as a teaching moment. Mandatory sensitivity training for the recruits. A formal reprimand in their files. But we handle it internally, quietly, without generating the kind of publicity that could damage the base's reputation. Kelly stared at the woman she'd trusted, the mentor who'd guided her through 3 years of professional growth. The woman who was now asking her to bury evidence of sexual assault for the sake of political convenience. Major, with respect, what happened today wasn't a misunderstanding that can be solved with sensitivity training. It was assault. It was recorded. And according to military regulations, it requires formal investigation and appropriate punishment. Collins's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her posture. A subtle straightening that suggested the friendly mentor was being replaced by the superior officer. Kelly, I understand your position. I really do. But I also understand the bigger picture. You're not the first female NCO to face this kind of harassment, and unfortunately, you probably won't be the last. But if we handle this incorrectly, it could set back women's advancement in this command for years. The logic was seductive in its twisted reasonableness. Sacrifice one battle to win the war. Accept one injustice to prevent greater injustices. It was the kind of compromise that had allowed systemic problems to fester in military institutions for decades. I need time to think about this, ma'am. Collins stood, her smile returning to the warm expression that had made Kelly trust her in the first place. Of course, take all the time you need. But Kelly, before you make any decisions, remember that you have a bright future in this army. Don't let one incident with 4 stupid kids derail everything you've worked for. The threat was delivered with a smile, wrapped in concern, seasoned with just enough plausible deniability to maintain the illusion of choice. It was a masterclass in institutional pressure, executed with the precision of someone who'd perfected the technique over decades of command. After Collins left, Kelly sat in the growing darkness of her office, staring at the monitors displaying security feeds from around the base. Soldiers moving through their evening routines, unaware that their trusted systems coordinator was facing a decision that would determine whether Fort Braxton was a place where justice mattered or just another institution where power protected itself. She opened her computer and began typing a new document. Not the informal resolution that Collins had suggested, but the formal incident report that military regulations demanded. Every detail, every timestamp, every witness statement that would be required for a proper investigation. But as she worked, she noticed something strange happening on her monitors. The feeds from the cafeteria were showing gaps, missing segments from the afternoon that should have been automatically archived. Someone with administrative access was deleting evidence, someone who knew exactly which cameras had captured the assault, someone who understood the base's security systems almost as well as she did. Kelly's fingers paused on the keyboard as a terrible possibility began to take shape. She pulled up the access logs for the security database, tracking who had viewed or modified surveillance data in the past 24 hours. Her own login appeared multiple times, which was normal for her daily responsibilities. But there was another series of entries that made her blood freeze. Administrative access from a command-level account, time-stamped just 30 minutes after her meeting with Major Collins. Someone was covering tracks with surgical precision. Someone who knew exactly what they were looking for and exactly how to make it disappear without leaving obvious traces. Kelly stared at the screen, her mind racing through the implications. Either there was a coincidence of staggering proportions, or her trusted mentor had just spent 30 minutes systematically destroying evidence of a crime she'd witnessed firsthand. The revelation hit her like a physical blow. The woman who'd guided her career, who'd fought for her advancement, who'd positioned herself as the protector of female soldiers on the base, was actively participating in a cover-up. But why? Kelly began digging deeper into the access logs, tracing patterns of data modification over the past 6 months. What she found made her stomach turn. 17 separate incidents of surveillance footage being altered or deleted. 17 cases where evidence of misconduct had mysteriously vanished from the base's security archives. 17 women whose complaints had been quietly buried. The pattern was clear once she knew what to look for. A systematic campaign of evidence destruction carried out with administrative privileges and insider knowledge of the security system's vulnerabilities. Someone had been running a protection racket for misconduct, ensuring that certain incidents never saw the light of day. And Major Sarah Collins had just revealed herself as either the architect of the conspiracy or its most valuable asset. Kelly's hands shook as she began copying files to an encrypted external drive. If Collins was involved, then trust was a luxury she could no longer afford. If the command structure was compromised, then going through official channels would be like handing her evidence directly to the people responsible for destroying it. She needed leverage. She needed allies. And she needed to move fast, because someone with administrative access to the security system would soon discover that their latest cover-up attempt had been witnessed by the one person on base who understood the system better than anyone. The phone on her desk rang, the harsh electronic tone cutting through the silence of her office. Kelly stared at the display, recognizing the extension immediately. Colonel James Harrison, base commander. The man whose career was supposedly at stake, whose promotion Collins claimed to be protecting. She let it ring twice more before answering, using the time to school her expression into professional neutrality, even though he couldn't see her. "Staff Sergeant Martinez speaking." "Kelly." Harrison's voice carried the kind of fatigue that came from command responsibility. "I understand there was an incident today. I'd like to see you in my office first thing tomorrow morning to discuss it." The summons was delivered politely, but Kelly heard the undertone of authority that made it clear this wasn't a request. "Yes, sir. What time would be convenient?" 0700 hours. "And Kelly, bring your incident report. I want to review the details personally." The line went dead, leaving Kelly staring at the phone with growing unease. In 8 years of service, she'd never been summoned to the colonel's office for a personal meeting. Harrison was a distant figure who managed through delegation, leaving direct personnel matters to his subordinate officers. Unless the matter was serious enough to threaten his command, or unless someone had convinced him that it was. Kelly glanced at her computer screen, where the evidence of systematic cover-ups glowed in the harsh fluorescent light of her office. 17 cases of deleted evidence. 17 women whose complaints had vanished into administrative black holes. And now she was about to become number 18. The weight of 8 years in uniform pressed down on her shoulders as she faced a choice that would define not just her career, but her character. She could walk into Harrison's office tomorrow morning, deliver her report, and watch it disappear into the same bureaucratic void that had swallowed 17 other complaints. Or she could fight. Kelly opened a secure communication application on her computer and began typing an encrypted message to an address she'd hoped never to use. The contact belonged to someone she'd served with in Afghanistan, a fellow NCO who'd transferred to the Inspector General's office after witnessing too many cover-ups in combat zones. Need urgent consultation regarding systematic evidence destruction at Fort Braxton. Multiple cases of sexual harassment, assault, being buried at command level. Request immediate guidance on proper reporting channels. Evidence package attached. She encrypted the files, attached them to the message, and hovered her cursor over the send button. Once she pressed it, there would be no going back. The Inspector General's office didn't take allegations of command-level corruption lightly. An investigation would follow, careers would be destroyed, and Kelly would find herself at the center of a firestorm that could end her military service. But 17 women had already paid the price for institutional cowardice. 17 soldiers had been betrayed by the very system that was supposed to protect them. Kelly pressed send. The message transmitted in seconds, carrying with it 8 years of accumulated trust in the institution she'd sworn to serve. She was crossing the Rubicon, moving from victim to whistleblower, from insider to threat. Her computer chimed with an automatic response. Message delivered. Response expected within 24 hours for urgent matters. 24 hours. Less than a day before the Inspector General's office would begin asking questions that Fort Braxton's command structure wasn't prepared to answer. Kelly began preparing for war. The evening shift change at Fort Braxton followed the same rhythms that had governed military installations for centuries. Soldiers moved through their routines with practiced efficiency, secure in the belief that their commanders would protect them and their systems would deliver justice when needed. Kelly watched them through her office window, young men and women who trusted the institution she was about to tear apart. Some of them would thank her when the truth came out. Others would see her as a traitor who'd destroyed their faith in the system that defined their lives. But faith built on lies was no faith at all. Her computer chimed with an incoming message from an encrypted address she didn't recognize. Kelly's pulse quickened as she opened the communication, expecting contact from the Inspector General's office. Instead, she found something that made her blood freeze. Your message has been forwarded to appropriate channels. Please be aware that multiple parties monitor communications involving Fort Braxton personnel. Recommend extreme caution in all activities until further notice. Trust is a luxury you cannot afford. The message was unsigned, untraceable, and carried the unmistakable weight of someone with insider knowledge. Someone who knew that her encrypted communication to the IG's office had been intercepted. Someone who understood that the corruption at Fort Braxton ran deeper than systematic evidence destruction. Kelly stared at the screen, her mind racing through the implications. If her secure communications were being monitored, then the cover-up involved people with access to military intelligence systems. People who could track digital communications, identify contacts, and neutralize threats before they developed into full investigations. The knock on her door came exactly 10 minutes after the anonymous message arrived. Kelly minimized her computer screen and called for entry, her hand instinctively moving to rest near her service weapon. Major Collins entered with the same fluid grace as before, but her expression had shifted subtly. The warm mentor was gone, replaced by someone calculating distances and angles with professional precision. "Working late again, Kelly?" Collins closed the door behind her and moved to the guest chair with deliberate casualness. "You know, all work and no play makes for a very stressed soldier." The pleasantries felt different now, loaded with subtext that Kelly was only beginning to understand. "Just catching up on some administrative work, ma'am." "Administrative work?" Collins repeated the phrase like she was tasting it. "That's interesting. I've been doing some administrative work myself this evening, reviewing access logs, monitoring communications, ensuring that base security systems are functioning properly." The threat was delivered with a smile, but its meaning was crystal clear. Collins knew about the message to the Inspector General. She knew about Kelly's investigation into the deleted evidence, and she was here to deliver terms for surrender. "Ma'am, I'm not sure I understand what you're suggesting." Collins leaned forward, her voice dropping to the intimate tone of someone sharing secrets. "Kelly, I've been watching your career for 3 years. You're talented, dedicated, absolutely committed to doing the right thing. Those are admirable qualities. They're also dangerous qualities when applied incorrectly." "Dangerous how, ma'am?" "Dangerous because sometimes the right thing for one person is the wrong thing for an institution. Sometimes protecting one victim means destroying dozens of careers, undermining an entire command structure, creating chaos that hurts more people than it helps." Kelly felt the familiar chill of institutional gaslighting, the psychological pressure that made victims question their own perceptions of reality. It was the same technique Collins had used earlier, refined and intensified for maximum impact. "With respect, ma'am, I think justice is worth some temporary chaos." Collins's smile faded, replaced by an expression of genuine sadness. "Oh, Kelly, you really don't understand what you're dealing with, do you?" The patronizing tone made Kelly's temper flare, but she kept her voice level. "Then help me understand, ma'am. What you're dealing with is bigger than Fort Braxton, bigger than Colonel Harrison's career, bigger than 4 stupid recruits who got carried away in a cafeteria." Collins stood and moved to the window, gazing out at the base where soldiers continued their evening routines. "You're dealing with a system that's been carefully balanced for decades. A system that protects people who matter from consequences they can't afford." The admission was delivered with casual confidence, as if discussing weather patterns or duty schedules. Collins wasn't denying the conspiracy. She was explaining why it was necessary. "People who matter?" Kelly's voice carried an edge of disbelief. "What about the 17 women whose complaints disappeared? Don't they matter?" Collins turned back to face her, and for the first time, Kelly saw something genuine in her expression. Not warmth or concern, but respect for a worthy opponent. 17 complaints that could have destroyed 17 careers. 17 cases where young men made mistakes that would have followed them for the rest of their lives. 17 situations where institutional mercy prevented individual tragedy. Institutional mercy? Kelly stood, her professional composure finally cracking. You're talking about covering up assault. You're talking about protecting predators at the expense of victims. I'm talking about perspective. Collins's voice remained calm, reasonable, like a teacher explaining basic concepts to a confused student. Kelly, in 22 years of service, I've learned that perfect justice is a luxury that military institutions can't afford. We deal in pragmatic solutions that serve the greater good. Whose greater good? The institution's greater good. The mission's greater good. The greater good that allows the United States Army to function as an effective fighting force instead of degenerating into the kind of scandal-ridden bureaucracy that can't defend the nation. Kelly stared at the woman she'd trusted, trying to reconcile the mentor who'd guided her career with the institutional enforcer standing before her. The cognitive dissonance was staggering, like discovering that someone you'd loved had been systematically poisoning you while claiming to protect your health. So you delete evidence, you silence victims, you protect predators, all for the greater good. I protect careers that matter from mistakes that don't. Collins returned to her chair, settling into it with the confidence of someone who'd had this conversation before. Kelly, you're 28 years old. You've served with distinction, but you've never commanded anything larger than a security detail. You don't understand the pressures that come with institutional responsibility. The condescension was breathtaking in its scope. Collins was simultaneously praising Kelly's service and dismissing her competence, acknowledging her dedication while explaining why it made her unfit to judge complex situations. I understand that 17 women trusted the institution to protect them, and the institution failed them completely. The institution protected them from the consequences of their own choices. Collins's tone sharpened, revealing the steel beneath the diplomatic facade. Kelly, every one of those 17 women put themselves in compromising situations. They attended parties where alcohol was involved. They engaged in behavior that could be misinterpreted. They made choices that created liability for their commands. Kelly felt something break inside her chest, a fundamental assumption about human decency that couldn't survive contact with Collins's casual victim blaming. You're saying they deserved what happened to them. I'm saying they contributed to what happened to them. And I'm saying that destroying careers over contributing factors isn't justice. It's vengeance masquerading as virtue. The philosophy was poison wrapped in institutional authority, delivered with the calm confidence of someone who'd spent years perfecting the rationalization of systemic abuse. Collins had turned protective instincts inside out, using the military's emphasis on unit cohesion to justify protecting predators from consequences. What about today? Kelly's voice was barely above a whisper. What about what happened to me? Collins's expression softened into something that might have been genuine sympathy. What happened to you was unacceptable. Those 4 recruits crossed a line, and they'll face appropriate consequences. But Kelly, you recorded it. You documented it. You turned a momentary lapse of judgment into evidence of criminal behavior. Because it was criminal behavior. Because you chose to make it criminal behavior instead of handling it as a disciplinary matter. Collins leaned forward, her voice taking on the urgent tone of someone delivering a final warning. Kelly, you have a choice to make. You can accept that this was an isolated incident involving 4 young men who made a mistake. You can allow the command structure to handle it appropriately through internal channels. And you can continue your career as one of the finest NCOs I've ever had the privilege to serve with. The offer hung in the air like smoke from a discharged weapon. complete capitulation in exchange for institutional protection, silence in exchange for career advancement, complicity in exchange for belonging. Or? Kelly asked. Collins's smile returned, but it carried no warmth. Or you can continue down the path you're currently traveling. You can pursue external investigations that will destroy this command, end careers that took decades to build, and create the kind of publicity that makes the Army look weak and incompetent to enemies who are watching for exactly that kind of opportunity. The stakes were laid out with surgical precision. Personal justice versus institutional stability. Individual courage versus collective security. The kind of choice that had no right answers, only consequences. And if I choose the second option, then you'll discover that loyalty is a two-way street, Kelly. The institution protects those who protect it, but the institution also remembers those who threaten it. Collins stood, straightening her uniform with the practiced movements of decades in service. 22 years has taught me that memory is the military's most powerful weapon. The threat was delivered with professional courtesy, wrapped in the kind of institutional language that provided plausible deniability while leaving no doubt about the consequences of defiance. I need time to think about this, ma'am. Of course you do. Take all the time you need. Collins moved toward the door, then paused with her hand on the knob. But Kelly, don't take too much time. Some opportunities have expiration dates. After Collins left, Kelly sat in the growing darkness of her office, staring at computer screens that displayed a base full of soldiers who trusted their institutions to protect them. The weight of 8 years in uniform pressed down on her shoulders, complicated by the growing realization that everything she'd believed about military justice had been carefully constructed lies. But lies, she reflected, only maintained their power when people chose to believe them. Kelly opened her computer and began typing a new message to the Inspector General's office. Not a request for guidance this time, but a formal whistleblower complaint naming specific officers and detailing systematic evidence destruction over a 6-month period. If Collins wanted to play institutional hardball, then Kelly would show her what institutional hardball looked like when practiced by someone who actually understood the regulations they'd sworn to uphold. The war was about to begin. Hold on, this is getting intense. Here's my question for you. If you were Kelly right now, discovering that your most trusted mentor is actually the one covering up 17 cases of assault, what would be your next move? Would you fight the system from within, or would you go external and risk everything? Drop a comment and let me know. I'm genuinely curious how you'd handle finding out that the person you trusted most was your biggest enemy. The message to the Inspector General's office transmitted at 11:47 p.m., carrying with it the accumulated weight of 8 years of military service and one woman's refusal to accept institutional corruption as the price of belonging. Kelly stared at the confirmation screen, knowing that she'd just crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Her secure phone buzzed with an incoming text from an unknown number. Package received. Response team mobilizing. Maintain normal routine until contact. Trust no one at command level. The speed of the response was both reassuring and terrifying. The Inspector General's office moved fast when presented with evidence of systematic corruption, but their involvement also meant that Fort Braxton was about to become ground zero for the kind of investigation that destroyed careers and shattered institutional trust. Kelly was preparing to leave her office when the base-wide announcement echoed through the corridors. All personnel report to designated assembly areas for mandatory formation. This is not a drill. Repeat, mandatory formation for all personnel. She checked her watch. 11:52 p.m. Emergency formations at midnight were almost unheard of, except during actual security threats or major disciplinary actions. Someone had decided that immediate damage control was necessary. Kelly gathered her files, secured her computer, and headed for the designated assembly area, her mind racing through the possibilities. Either the IG's office had moved faster than expected, or someone at Fort Braxton had received advance warning about the investigation. The main assembly area buzzed with confused soldiers forming ranks in the harsh glare of stadium lighting. Kelly found her position among the NCOs, noting the tension that ran through the formation like an electric current. Midnight formations meant bad news, and everyone knew it. Colonel Harrison emerged from the command building with the measured pace of someone carrying institutional authority like a weapon. Major Collins flanked him on the right, her expression carefully neutral. Behind them walked Captain Rodriguez from the legal office and Chief Master Sergeant Williams, the senior enlisted advisor whose presence meant this wasn't routine administrative business. Harrison took position at the podium, his voice carrying across the formation with the authority of someone who'd commanded soldiers for 25 years. Ladies and gentlemen, effective immediately, Fort Braxton is under investigation by the Inspector General's office. All personnel are directed to cooperate fully with investigating officers. The murmur that ran through the formation was quickly suppressed by NCO authority, but Kelly could feel the shock rippling through the ranks. IG investigations were serious business, the kind of thing that ended careers and destroyed reputations. During the course of this investigation, no personnel will discuss matters under review with anyone outside the official investigation team. No personnel will access, modify, or delete any electronic records or files without specific authorization from the investigating officers. Kelly felt Collins's eyes on her from across the formation, but kept her expression professionally neutral. The timing was suspicious. Either someone had advance warning about her complaint, or the military bureaucracy moved faster than she'd believed possible. Furthermore, Harrison continued, effective immediately, all security system access is restricted to essential personnel only. Staff Sergeant Martinez will remain available to assist investigating officers with technical matters, but all routine access to surveillance systems is suspended, pending completion of the investigation. The specific mention of her name sent a chill down Kelly's spine. In a formation of 1,200 personnel, being singled out by name meant that someone wanted everyone to know she was involved in whatever had triggered the investigation. This investigation does not reflect on the dedication and professionalism of Fort Braxton personnel. However, it does require absolute cooperation and complete honesty from everyone involved. Failure to cooperate with investigating officers will result in charges under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Harrison's voice carried the weight of 25 years of command authority, but Kelly detected something else underneath the official rhetoric: uncertainty, fear, the kind of anxiety that came from facing threats he couldn't control through normal command channels. Dismissed. Return to your quarters. Normal duty schedule resumes at 0600 hours. The formation dissolved with the controlled chaos of 1,200 soldiers trying to process unexpected information. Kelly moved with the crowd, but felt a hand on her shoulder as she approached the exit. Staff Sergeant Martinez. Chief Master Sergeant Williams's voice carried the gravitas of someone who'd spent 30 years perfecting the art of enlisted leadership. Colonel Harrison would like to see you in his office. The summons wasn't unexpected, but the timing was ominous. Kelly had hoped for at least a few hours to prepare for the inevitable confrontation with base leadership. Instead, she was being hauled directly from the formation to face questions she wasn't prepared to answer. Williams escorted her through corridors that felt different in the harsh fluorescent lighting that illuminated night operations. Soldiers moved through their duties with the subdued efficiency that came from knowing their base was under investigation, their routines disrupted by forces beyond their control. Harrison's office reflected 25 years of careful career management. Awards lined the walls in precise arrangements. Photographs showed him with various dignitaries and military leaders, and his desk displayed the kind of organized efficiency that came from commanding large organizations. He was standing at the window when Kelly entered, staring out at a base full of soldiers whose trust he was responsible for maintaining. Williams took position near the door, his presence adding weight to whatever conversation was about to unfold. "Staff Sergeant Martinez." Harrison turned to face her, his expression carefully controlled. "I understand you've had a difficult day." Kelly came to attention with reflexive precision. "Yes, sir." At ease, Harrison moved to his desk, settling into the chair that represented ultimate authority at Fort Braxton. "Kelly, I've been commanding soldiers for 25 years. I've served in combat, managed personnel crises, dealt with situations that would challenge anyone's faith in human nature." The opening felt like the beginning of a carefully rehearsed speech, designed to establish authority while projecting understanding. Kelly waited for the follow-up, knowing that everything depended on how she navigated the next few minutes. "But in all those years, I've never faced a situation quite like this one. An investigation that threatens not just individual careers, but the institutional trust that allows this base to function effectively." Harrison's voice carried the weight of genuine concern, but Kelly detected the undertone of someone building toward a specific conclusion. "Sir, I'm not sure I understand what you're asking me. I'm asking you to help me understand how we got here. How a routine disciplinary matter involving 4 recruits escalated into an Inspector General investigation that could destroy this command." The phrasing was careful, designed to frame the assault as minor misconduct rather than serious criminal behavior. It was the same rhetorical technique Collins had used, redefining reality through administrative language. "Sir, what happened today wasn't routine disciplinary misconduct. It was assault. It was recorded by multiple witnesses. And according to military regulations, it requires formal investigation and appropriate punishment." Harrison nodded, but his expression suggested he was hearing confirmation of something he'd already suspected. "Kelly, you're absolutely right about the regulations. You're absolutely right about the severity of what happened, but you're missing something important about institutional responsibility. Sir, you're missing the fact that sometimes perfect justice isn't possible. Sometimes the system has to choose between competing priorities, and those choices require sacrifice from everyone involved." Kelly felt the familiar chill of institutional pressure, the psychological weight that made victims question their own perceptions of right and wrong. "Sir, with respect, I don't think justice should be sacrificed for institutional convenience." Harrison's expression shifted subtly, revealing something harder beneath the paternal concern. "Institutional convenience? Kelly, do you understand what this investigation will do to Fort Braxton? Do you understand how many careers will be destroyed? How many families will be affected? How much institutional trust will be lost?" The questions were designed to make her feel responsible for consequences she hadn't chosen, to transfer blame from the people who'd created the problems to the person who'd exposed them. It was manipulation disguised as moral reasoning. "Sir, I understand that covering up assault has consequences. I understand that protecting predators creates liability. And I understand that institutional trust built on lies isn't worth preserving." The words hung in the air like an undetonated explosive. Kelly had just accused her commanding officer of participating in a systematic cover-up, using language that made denial impossible without outright lies. Harrison stared at her for a long moment, his expression cycling through surprise, anger, and something that might have been respect. "That's a very serious accusation, Staff Sergeant." "Yes, sir, it is." "Do you have evidence to support that accusation?" Kelly felt the weight of everything she had discovered pressing down on her shoulders. The 17 deleted cases, the systematic evidence destruction, the pattern of cover-ups that stretched back 6 months. "Yes, sir, I do." Harrison stood and moved to the window again, staring out at the base he'd commanded for 3 years. When he spoke, his voice carried the exhaustion of someone who'd fought battles he couldn't win. "Kelly, I'm going to tell you something that's going to change how you think about military service. Something that's going to challenge every assumption you've made about institutional justice." He turned to face her, and for the first time she saw something genuine in his expression. Not authority or manipulation, but the weight of someone carrying knowledge he wished he didn't possess. "What you've discovered isn't unique to Fort Braxton. It's not the result of a few corrupt officers making bad decisions. It's the way the system actually works when institutional survival comes into conflict with individual justice." The admission hit Kelly like a physical blow. Harrison wasn't denying the cover-up. He was explaining why it was systematic, rather than aberrant. Every base deals with these situations. Every command makes these choices. Because the alternative is institutional destruction that serves no one and protects no one. Kelly stared at the man she'd respected for 3 years, trying to reconcile the leader she'd trusted with the institutional enforcer standing before her. "Sir, are you saying that assault is acceptable if investigating it threatens institutional stability?" "I'm saying that perfect justice is a luxury that military institutions can't afford. I'm saying that sometimes protecting 99 good soldiers requires sacrificing justice for one victim." The utilitarian calculation was delivered with matter-of-fact precision, as if discussing resource allocation or training schedules. Harrison had reduced human dignity to a cost-benefit analysis where institutional survival always outweighed individual rights. "What about the 17 other victims? Were they acceptable losses too?" Harrison's expression darkened, revealing the steel beneath the paternal concern. "Those 17 cases were handled appropriately through internal channels. No crimes were committed, no permanent harm was done, and no institutional damage occurred." "No permanent harm?" Kelly's voice cracked with disbelief. "Sir, those women were assaulted. They were violated. They were betrayed by the institution they trusted to protect them. They were involved in situations that created liability for their commands. They made choices that contributed to unfortunate outcomes, and they were protected from the consequences of pursuing formal complaints that would have destroyed their own careers along with their attackers." The victim blaming was comprehensive and systematic, delivered with the casual confidence of someone who'd perfected the technique over years of practice. Harrison had turned protective instincts inside out, using concern for victims to justify protecting their attackers. Kelly felt something fundamental break inside her chest, a basic assumption about human decency that couldn't survive contact with Harrison's institutional philosophy. "Sir, with respect, that's not protection. That's complicity. That's reality, Staff Sergeant. That's 25 years of command experience teaching me that institutional survival sometimes requires choices that individual soldiers can't understand." The condescension was breathtaking in its scope. Harrison was simultaneously acknowledging her service and dismissing her competence, praising her dedication while explaining why it made her unfit to judge complex situations. "I think individual soldiers understand justice better than institutions understand humanity." Harrison returned to his desk, settling into his chair with the deliberate movements of someone reasserting authority. "Kelly, you have a choice to make. You can accept that this investigation will proceed according to appropriate channels, with appropriate outcomes that serve institutional interests. Or you can discover that loyalty is a two-way street in the United States Army. The institution protects those who protect it. But the institution also has long memories when it comes to those who threaten it. The threat was delivered with professional courtesy, but its meaning was unmistakable. Comply or face consequences that would extend far beyond Fort Braxton. Kelly stood at attention, her voice carrying the clarity of someone who'd finally understood the choice she was facing. "Sir, request permission to be dismissed." "Granted. But Kelly, think carefully about your next steps. Some choices can't be undone." Kelly left Harrison's office with the weight of 8 years of military service pressing down on her shoulders, complicated by the growing realization that everything she'd believed about institutional justice had been carefully constructed, lies designed to maintain systems that protected predators at the expense of victims. But some lies, she reflected, only maintained their power when people chose to believe them. And some choices, while irreversible, were necessary for survival with dignity intact. The war was no longer coming. It had arrived. And Kelly Martinez was done fighting on behalf of institutions that viewed justice as an inconvenient obstacle to operational efficiency. Outside Harrison's office, the base continued its night operations with the steady rhythm that had governed military installations for centuries. Soldiers moved through their routines, trusting their commanders to protect them and their systems to deliver justice when needed. Tomorrow, Kelly would begin teaching them that trust built on lies was no trust at all. Tonight, she would prepare for a battle that would determine whether Fort Braxton was a place where honor mattered or just another institution where power protected itself from accountability. The timestamp on her watch read 01:33:47 when she made her final decision. 26 hours after Recruit Jackson had announced that she was just a girl playing soldier anyway, Staff Sergeant Kelly Martinez chose to show the entire United States Army what happened when that girl decided to play for keeps. We're at the breaking point now. Everything Kelly thought she knew about military justice has been turned upside down. The people she trusted most are the ones orchestrating the cover-up. The evidence she's gathered could bring down an entire command structure. But here's what's coming that will blow your mind. The real mastermind behind all 17 cover-ups isn't who you think it is. The next revelation will make you question everything you've seen so far. I promise. What happens next will completely rewrite this entire story. The secure phone in Kelly's quarters buzzed at 2:50 with an encrypted message that would change everything. Investigation team arriving 0600. Safe house protocols activated. Trust established contacts only. Situation more complex than initial assessment. Kelly stared at the message in the dim light of her quarters, her mind racing through the implications. Situation more complex meant the Inspector General's office had discovered additional problems beyond her initial complaint. Safe house protocols meant they considered her to be in physical danger from people with the authority to make problems disappear permanently. She was no longer just a whistleblower reporting institutional corruption. She had become a protected witness in a federal investigation that could tear apart the command structure of one of the largest military installations in the United States. Her computer chimed with another encrypted message, this one from an address she recognized as belonging to Captain Jennifer Walsh, the IG investigator she'd contacted. Recommend immediate departure from base quarters. Transportation arranged. Maintain communication silence until secure location reached. Kelly stared at the screen, realizing that her life as she'd known it for 8 years was over. Tomorrow morning, she would leave Fort Braxton not as a trusted NCO returning to duty, but as a federal witness whose testimony could destroy careers and send people to federal prison. The weight of that transformation was staggering. She had always imagined herself retiring from the Army after 20 years of service, receiving a pension and the gratitude of a nation she'd served with distinction. Instead, she was about to become a pariah in the institution that had defined her adult life. But some prices, she reflected, were worth paying. Kelly began packing essential items into a single duffel bag, following protocols she'd learned during deployment for rapid movement under hostile conditions. Documents, personal items, the encrypted drives containing evidence that could prove systematic corruption at multiple levels of command. As she packed, her mind wandered to the 17 women whose complaints had disappeared into administrative black holes. Tomorrow, their voices would finally be heard. Tomorrow, the system that had silenced them would face consequences for its betrayal. The soft knock on her door came at 03:30 a.m., delivered with the precise rhythm that meant official business. Kelly checked the security viewer and recognized Chief Master Sergeant Williams, the senior enlisted advisor whose presence at this hour meant either legitimate emergency or serious threat. She opened the door to find Williams flanked by 2 military police officers, their expressions carefully neutral in the way that suggested official business of a sensitive nature. "Staff Sergeant Martinez," Williams said, his voice carrying the formal tone that meant this wasn't a social visit. "Colonel Harrison requests your immediate presence for a matter of urgent security." Kelly felt ice form in her stomach. Either the IG investigation had moved faster than expected, or someone at Fort Braxton had decided that her testimony posed an unacceptable threat to institutional survival. "Chief, what kind of security matter?" "The kind that requires immediate attention from personnel with access to sensitive systems," Williams replied, his expression giving nothing away. "Please accompany us to the command center." Kelly grabbed her jacket and followed them into the corridor, her mind racing through possibilities. The command center at 03:30 a.m. meant either genuine emergency or elaborate trap. Given everything she'd discovered about Fort Braxton's leadership, she was betting on the latter. The base at night felt different, quieter, more ominous, filled with shadows that seemed to conceal threats just beyond perception. The few soldiers they encountered snapped to attention for Chief Williams, but Kelly caught the curious glances directed at her unusual 3 a.m. escort. The command center buzzed with activity that seemed excessive for routine night operations. Officers she didn't recognize worked at computer terminals, their uniforms bearing the insignia of units not normally stationed at Fort Braxton. Either Fort Braxton was facing a genuine security crisis, or someone had imported enough outside personnel to handle a major internal investigation. Colonel Harrison stood at the central control station, studying displays that showed base-wide surveillance feeds. Major Collins flanked him on the right, her expression carefully neutral. Behind them stood a figure Kelly didn't recognize, a tall woman in civilian clothes whose bearing suggested federal authority. "Staff Sergeant Martinez," Harrison said without turning around. "Thank you for responding so quickly to our emergency." Kelly came to attention, but her eyes remained fixed on the civilian whose presence suggested this wasn't routine military business. "Sir, Chief Williams said there was a security matter requiring my expertise." "There is." Harrison finally turned to face her, and Kelly saw something in his expression that hadn't been there during their earlier conversation. Resignation. The look of someone who'd realized that carefully laid plans were collapsing beyond salvage. "Kelly," the civilian said, stepping forward with credentials in her hand. "I'm Special Agent Sarah Chen with the Defense Criminal Investigative Service. I think it's time we had an honest conversation about what's been happening at Fort Braxton." The revelation hit Kelly like a physical blow. DCIS meant Federal Criminal Investigation, the kind of serious law enforcement attention that resulted in criminal prosecutions rather than administrative discipline. Someone at Fort Braxton had committed federal crimes serious enough to warrant investigation by military law enforcement specialists. Agent Chen has been investigating systematic evidence destruction and conspiracy to obstruct justice at multiple military installations, Harrison said, his voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who'd fought battles he couldn't win. Your complaint to the Inspector General's office confirmed intelligence they'd been developing for 18 months. Kelly stared at the assembled group, trying to process the implications. Sir, are you saying this investigation was already ongoing? I'm saying, Agent Chen interrupted, that Fort Braxton was the final piece of a puzzle we've been assembling across 7 different military installations. Your evidence provided the documentation we needed to move from surveillance to prosecution. The scope was staggering. Not just Fort Braxton, but 7 installations. Not just a few corrupt officers, but a systematic conspiracy that spanned multiple commands and thousands of personnel. Agent Chen, Kelly said carefully, what exactly are you investigating? A criminal conspiracy involving the systematic suppression of sexual assault complaints in exchange for financial compensation and career advancement. A network that includes senior officers at multiple installations, defense contractors, and civilian officials in positions of oversight authority. The words hung in the air like smoke from a discharged weapon. Kelly had stumbled onto something far larger than institutional corruption at a single base. She had discovered a criminal enterprise that treated military justice as a commodity to be bought and sold for the right price. Kelly, Harrison said, his voice carrying genuine regret, I need you to understand something. When I told you that this was bigger than Fort Braxton, I wasn't trying to intimidate you. I was trying to warn you about forces I couldn't control. Kelly stared at the man she'd served under for 3 years, seeing him clearly for the first time. Not a corrupt commander protecting his career, but a compromised officer caught between criminal conspirators and federal investigators. Sir, are you saying you were trying to protect me? I'm saying I was trying to protect everyone I could while gathering evidence for Agent Chen's investigation. Sometimes that meant making choices that looked like betrayal, but served a larger purpose. The revelation reframed everything she'd experienced in the past 24 hours. Harrison's warnings about institutional consequences, his emphasis on larger forces beyond her understanding. His carefully worded threats that had felt like intimidation, but might have been desperate attempts to keep her safe until federal protection could be arranged. Colonel Harrison has been cooperating with our investigation for 14 months, Agent Chen said. His position required him to appear complicit while actually documenting criminal activity for our evidence files. Kelly felt the world shift beneath her feet as assumptions collapsed and reconstructed themselves around new information. Sir, what about Major Collins? Is she part of the investigation too? The silence that followed her question was answer enough. Harrison's expression darkened, and Agent Chen's hand moved instinctively toward her weapon. Major Collins, Harrison said carefully, has been the primary target of this investigation from the beginning. Everything we've done for the past 14 months has been designed to document her criminal activity and identify her co-conspirators. The words hit Kelly like artillery fire, destroying her remaining assumptions about Fort Braxton's command structure. Collins wasn't just a corrupt officer protecting her career. She was the architect of a criminal conspiracy that had victimized hundreds of soldiers across multiple installations. Agent Chen, Kelly said, her voice barely above a whisper. Where is Major Collins now? That, Agent Chen replied, is why we needed you here at 0330 hours. Major Collins hasn't been seen since 2200 hours yesterday. Her quarters are empty, her vehicle is missing, and she's not responding to communication attempts. Kelly felt ice form in her stomach as the implications became clear. You think she's running. I think she's eliminating loose ends, Agent Chen said grimly. Kelly, in the past 18 months, 4 potential witnesses in our investigation have died in accidents that were never properly investigated. Major Collins has access to personnel files, travel records, and communication logs for every person who might threaten her conspiracy. The threat was real and immediate. Kelly wasn't just a whistleblower whose testimony could destroy careers. She was a witness whose evidence could send people to federal prison for decades. In Collins's calculation, Kelly had transformed from protected mentee to existential threat. Agent Chen, what do you need me to do? Right now, I need you to help us reconstruct the timeline of evidence destruction over the past 6 months. Your access to security systems makes you the only person who can provide the technical evidence we need for criminal prosecution. Kelly nodded, her mind already shifting into the focused mode that had made her an expert in military security systems. I can provide timestamps, access logs, and documentation for every piece of evidence that was destroyed or modified. That's exactly what we need. But Kelly, I want you to understand something. Once you provide that testimony, you'll be under federal protection until this investigation is complete. Your military career is effectively over. Your life as you've known it is finished. The choice was stark and irreversible. Testify and lose everything she'd worked for, or remain silent and allow a criminal conspiracy to continue victimizing soldiers across the military. Kelly thought about the 17 women whose complaints had disappeared, about the unknown number of victims at 6 other installations, about the young female soldiers who would serve in the future, trusting institutions to protect them from predators. Agent Chen, how quickly can we get started? The smile that crossed the federal agent's face was grim but genuine. Colonel Harrison, please escort Staff Sergeant Martinez to the secure conference room. I'll begin arranging witness protection protocols. As they moved through corridors that felt different in the harsh fluorescent lighting, Kelly reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. 24 hours ago, she had been a trusted NCO dealing with a routine harassment complaint. Now, she was a federal witness whose testimony would expose a criminal conspiracy that reached far beyond Fort Braxton. The transformation was staggering, but necessary. Some battles, she had learned, were worth fighting regardless of personal cost. Some truths were worth telling regardless of institutional consequences. Behind them, Agent Chen spoke quietly into a secure communication device, arranging the kind of federal protection that would keep Kelly alive long enough to testify against people who had turned military justice into a criminal enterprise. The war was no longer coming. It had arrived. And Staff Sergeant Kelly Martinez was about to discover that sometimes the only way to save an institution was to tear it apart and rebuild it from the foundation up. Tomorrow would bring testimony that would destroy careers, reveal criminal conspiracies, and force the United States military to confront the systematic corruption that had flourished in the shadows of institutional authority. Tonight, Kelly prepared to become the kind of soldier she'd always imagined herself to be. Someone who fought for justice regardless of personal cost, who protected the innocent regardless of institutional pressure, and who refused to accept that honor was a luxury that military institutions couldn't afford. The timestamp on the secure conference room's clock read 04:47:33 when Kelly began providing testimony that would change everything. 18 hours after recruit Jackson had announced that she was just a girl playing soldier anyway, Staff Sergeant Kelly Martinez was showing the entire United States military what happened when that girl decided to fight back with the full force of federal law enforcement behind her. But even as she spoke into recording equipment that would preserve her words for criminal trials and congressional hearings, Kelly knew that the hardest battles were still ahead. Exposing the conspiracy was only the beginning. Rebuilding trust in institutions that had betrayed it would take generations. The real war was just starting. The secure conference room at Fort Braxton became ground zero for the largest military justice investigation in decades, as Kelly Martinez provided testimony that would reshape institutional accountability across the United States Armed Forces. For 6 hours, she walked federal investigators through 18 months of systematic evidence destruction, documenting a criminal conspiracy that reached far beyond anyone's initial understanding. Agent Chen's recording equipment captured every detail as Kelly reconstructed the technical timeline of Major Collins's criminal enterprise. Access logs showing pattern deletions, financial records revealing payments to accomplices, communication intercepts proving coordination across 7 military installations. "The sophistication is staggering," Agent Chen muttered, reviewing Kelly's documentation. Collins didn't just delete evidence, she created false evidence to support alternative narratives, fabricated witness statements, manipulated timestamps, even altered medical records to support claims that victims were lying about their assaults. Colonel Harrison sat at the conference table, his expression cycling through relief and horror as the full scope of Collins's conspiracy became clear. "Agent Chen, how many victims are we talking about across all 7 installations?" Based on Staff Sergeant Martinez's analysis and our parallel investigations, we're looking at approximately 147 cases of sexual assault that were systematically covered up over the past 3 years. Collins's network generated over $800,000 in hush money payments, career advancement guarantees, and protection services. The numbers hit Kelly like artillery fire. 147 women whose complaints had been buried, nearly $1 million in corruption payments, 3 years of systematic betrayal by institutions designed to protect them. "Agent Chen," Kelly said, her voice carefully controlled, "what happens to Collins now?" "Right now, Major Collins is the subject of a federal manhunt involving multiple agencies. But Kelly, I need you to understand something. Collins has resources we're still trying to identify: financial accounts, communication networks, protection assets that extend beyond military channels." The implication was clear. Collins wasn't just a corrupt officer. She was the center of a criminal organization with the capability to eliminate threats permanently. Kelly's secure phone buzzed with an encrypted message. "Package tracked to civilian location 47 miles northeast. Moving to intercept. Maintain secure position until further notice." Agent Chen glanced at the message and her expression hardened. "Kelly, we may have found Collins, but that also means Collins may have found us." The next 12 hours unfolded with the precision of a military operation designed by someone who understood both sides of the conflict. Federal agents coordinated with military police, establishing security perimeters around Fort Braxton, while hunting teams pursued Collins through civilian territory where her institutional authority meant nothing. Kelly remained in federal protection, but her role had evolved from protected witness to active participant in the investigation. Her technical expertise with military security systems made her essential for interpreting evidence and identifying additional victims across the 7-installation conspiracy. "Agent Chen," Kelly said, reviewing financial records on her secured laptop, "I found something that changes everything." "What kind of something?" Collins wasn't working alone inside the military command structure. "Look at these payment authorizations. They require approval from personnel at the Pentagon level. Collins had protection from people with authority over Inspector General investigations themselves." Agent Chen stared at the screen, her expression shifting from concentration to alarm. "Kelly, are you telling me this conspiracy reaches into Defense Department leadership?" "I'm telling you that Collins had advance warning about every investigation, every complaint, every potential threat to her operation. Someone with access to the highest levels of military justice oversight was feeding her information." The revelation transformed the investigation from a multi-installation conspiracy to a potential corruption scandal that could reach the highest levels of military leadership. If Collins had protection from Pentagon officials, then the entire military justice system was compromised at its foundation. Kelly's phone buzzed with an urgent message. Target located. Preparing for arrest. Congressional hearing moved to emergency session. Testimony required within 24 hours. "Agent Chen, what's a congressional hearing?" "Kelly, when a federal investigation uncovers corruption at this level, Congress gets involved. You're going to testify before the House Armed Services Committee about everything you've discovered. Your testimony will be broadcast live, and it will determine whether the military justice system gets completely restructured." The weight of that responsibility was staggering. Kelly's words would influence how the United States military handled sexual assault cases for generations to come. Her testimony would determine whether Collins's 147 victims received justice or remained buried in institutional denial. "Agent Chen, I need to understand something. If Collins is arrested, if the conspiracy is exposed, what happens to Fort Braxton? What happens to the soldiers who trusted these institutions?" "That," Agent Chen said with grim honesty, "depends on how well we rebuild trust that's been systematically destroyed over 3 years. Kelly, institutional reform is harder than institutional destruction. Exposing corruption is just the beginning." The arrest came at 14/27/33 on the second day, exactly 24 hours after the timestamp that had started everything. Federal agents surrounded a safe house 47 miles from Fort Braxton, where Major Sarah Collins had been coordinating with Pentagon contacts to eliminate evidence and neutralize witnesses. The irony of the timing wasn't lost on Kelly as she watched the arrest footage in the Federal Command Center. Collins, the woman who'd spent 3 years manipulating timestamps to hide crimes, was captured at the exact moment when her own conspiracy had begun to unravel. "Collins isn't going quietly," Agent Chen reported, monitoring communications from the arrest team. "She's demanding immunity in exchange for testimony about Pentagon involvement. She claims she can expose corruption that reaches the highest levels of Defense Department leadership." Kelly felt ice form in her stomach. Is she telling the truth? Probably. Criminal organizations at this level don't survive without protection from people with institutional authority. Collins was middle management in a conspiracy that we're only beginning to understand. The scope kept expanding beyond anything Kelly had imagined when she'd first reported the cafeteria assault. What had started as a complaint about 4 recruits had become evidence of systematic corruption that compromised military justice at every level. Her secure communication device chimed with a message from Captain Walsh at the Inspector General's office. "Congressional hearing confirmed for tomorrow, 0900 hours. National television coverage. Your testimony will be the centerpiece of military justice reform legislation." Kelly stared at the message, realizing that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't predict or control. Tomorrow, she would sit before Congress and the American peoples, telling a story that would force the nation to confront the systematic failure of institutions designed to protect those who served. The congressional hearing room buzzed with the controlled chaos of democracy in action as Kelly Martinez took her place at the witness table. Cameras from every major news network captured her arrival, while members of the House Armed Services Committee reviewed testimony that would reshape military justice for generations. Committee Chair Representative Johnson gavelled the hearing to order with the gravity befitting an investigation that had exposed systematic corruption across multiple military installations. Ladies and gentlemen, we are here today to examine allegations of criminal conspiracy within our nation's military justice system. Kelly sat at the witness table, flanked by Agent Chen and military legal counsel, facing questions that would determine whether Collins's 147 victims received justice or remained buried in institutional denial. Staff Sergeant Martinez, Representative Johnson began, please tell the committee about the events of 2 days ago that led to this investigation. Kelly leaned toward the microphone, her voice carrying across the hearing room and into millions of American homes via live television coverage. Mr. Chairman, it started with 4 words. She's just a girl playing soldier anyway. The testimony that followed lasted 4 hours and covered 3 years of systematic corruption. Kelly walked the committee through Collins's criminal enterprise, explaining how institutional authority had been weaponized to protect predators and silence victims. The sophistication was staggering, Kelly testified. Major Collins didn't just delete evidence. She created alternative narratives, fabricated witness statements, manipulated security footage, even altered medical records to support claims that victims were lying about their assaults. Representative Williams, the ranking minority member, leaned forward with the intensity of someone who'd served in combat. Staff Sergeant Martinez, are you telling this committee that a field-grade officer systematically destroyed evidence of sexual assault across multiple military installations? Yes, sir. 147 documented cases over 3 years, nearly $1 million in corruption payments, and protection from Pentagon officials who provided advance warning about investigations. The revelation sent shockwaves through the hearing room. Pentagon involvement meant the corruption reached the highest levels of military leadership, calling into question the integrity of the entire military justice system. Staff Sergeant Martinez, Representative Davis asked, what gave you the courage to come forward when so many others remained silent? Kelly paused, thinking about the 17 women whose complaints had been buried, about the unknown victims at 6 other installations, about the young female soldiers who would serve in the future. Ma'am, someone told me that orders don't cover honor. I realized that protecting an institution that betrays its own people isn't honor. It's complicity. Real honor means fighting for justice, even when the fight costs everything you've worked for. The silence that followed her words was broken by spontaneous applause from the gallery, where military families and advocacy groups had gathered to witness institutional accountability in action. Committee Chair Johnson restored order, then delivered the announcement that would change everything. Based on testimony presented today, this committee will draft emergency legislation requiring independent oversight of all military sexual assault investigations. Furthermore, we are recommending criminal prosecution of all personnel involved in this conspiracy. The gavel fell with the finality of institutional transformation. Major Sarah Collins's criminal enterprise had been exposed, documented, and condemned at the highest levels of American government. But the hardest work was still ahead. 6 months later, Staff Sergeant Kelly Martinez stood in the same cafeteria where her journey had begun, watching new recruits learn about military justice from instructors who understood that honor couldn't be compromised for institutional convenience. The changes had been swift and comprehensive. Collins was serving 15 years in federal prison, with 17 Pentagon officials facing criminal charges for their roles in the conspiracy. The military justice system had been restructured with independent oversight, mandatory recording of all assault investigations, and civilian review boards with authority over institutional decisions. Kelly's role had evolved from systems coordinator to military justice reform specialist, working with Congress and advocacy groups to ensure that institutional changes translated into cultural transformation. Her testimony had become required viewing for all military personnel, part of expanded training that emphasized individual responsibility over institutional loyalty. Staff Sergeant Martinez, the voice belonged to Lieutenant Sarah Thompson, one of the new officers assigned to implement justice reform protocols. We've received the final report on institutional changes across all 7 installations. Kelly accepted the document, scanning statistics that represented fundamental transformation. Zero-tolerance policies with mandatory prosecution. Independent oversight committees with civilian authority. Victim advocacy programs staffed by personnel outside the chain of command. Most importantly, a new security protocol that required time-stamped documentation of all assault allegations, with automatic escalation to federal authorities if evidence showed signs of tampering or deletion. The timestamp system that had exposed Collins's conspiracy had become the foundation for ensuring it could never happen again. Lieutenant Thompson, Kelly said, "What's the status on victim compensation?" All 147 victims have been contacted. Financial compensation has been approved by Congress. Medical and psychological support services are being coordinated by the Veterans Administration, and every perpetrator identified through the investigation is facing appropriate criminal charges. Justice, Kelly reflected, was finally being served. Not perfect justice. Nothing could undo 3 years of systematic betrayal, but meaningful justice that acknowledged institutional failure and demanded institutional reform. Her secure phone chimed with a message from Agent Chen. Final prosecutions complete. Collins conspiracy dismantled. Congressional Oversight Committee established. Your testimony cited as Foundation for Military Justice Reform Act. Kelly smiled, remembering the 28-year-old NCO who'd walked into this cafeteria 6 months ago, trusting institutions to protect her from predators in uniform. That woman had believed in systems that had failed her completely. The woman walking out today understood that real protection came from citizens willing to hold institutions accountable, regardless of personal cost. Staff Sergeant Martinez? Lieutenant Thompson's voice carried the respect that came from understanding what Kelly had sacrificed to create the reformed system they now served. The new recruits are asking about the timestamp protocol. They want to understand why every security camera on base displays 14/27/33 as a memorial marker. Kelly paused at the cafeteria exit, looking back at table 14 where everything had started. A small plaque now marked the spot where 4 recruits had made a decision that ultimately exposed systematic corruption across the entire military justice system. Tell them, Kelly said, that 14/27/33 represents the moment when someone decided that institutional honor was more important than institutional convenience. Tell them that every timestamp after that moment represents a choice between protecting predators and protecting victims. She walked toward the exit, leaving behind the woman who'd trusted institutions to deliver justice and embracing the citizen who'd learned to demand it. The base around her hummed with the energy of 1,200 personnel learning that real security came from accountability, not authority. Outside, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across Fort Braxton, illuminating a military installation that had been transformed from the inside out. New protocols, new oversight, new cultural expectations that valued victims over institutional reputation. Kelly's final log entry as Fort Braxton's systems coordinator would be simple. 14/27/33. The moment honor chose justice over convenience. All systems secure. But the real security, she knew, would come from the generations of soldiers who would serve in institutions that had learned the difference between protecting authority and protecting the people. Authority was meant to serve. Justice isn't a feeling. It's a file that outweighs denial. And sometimes it's a 28-year-old staff sergeant who refuses to accept that orders cover dishonor, that institutional survival justifies individual sacrifice, or that military justice is a luxury the military can't afford. Sometimes justice is just someone brave enough to say that a girl playing soldier can outfight a system built to silence her. The timestamp, 14/27/33, would forever mark the moment when everything changed. Not just for Kelly Martinez, not just for Fort Braxton, but for every soldier who would serve in institutions that had finally learned the difference between honor and convenience. The war was over. Honor had won. But victory, Kelly had learned, carried responsibilities that extended far beyond the battlefield. 6 months of institutional reform had taught her that exposing corruption was the easy part. Rebuilding trust required generations of consistent action. Every day brought new challenges from personnel who'd learned to game previous systems, from victims who'd lost faith in institutional protection, from leaders struggling to balance accountability with operational effectiveness. Kelly's new role as military justice reform specialist took her across the country, visiting installations where Collins's network had operated, speaking to commanders who were implementing the new protocols she'd helped design. Each base told a similar story. Initial resistance giving way to grudging acceptance. Then genuine transformation as personnel discovered that accountability actually improved, rather than hindered military effectiveness. The hardest part, she told a gathering of senior NCOs at Fort Campbell, isn't changing regulations. It's changing the culture that allowed systematic abuse to flourish for years. Every soldier in this room has the power to prevent another Collins from destroying lives and careers. The audiences varied. Seasoned veterans who'd witnessed decades of institutional failures. Young officers trying to understand how justice fit into command responsibility. Enlisted personnel learning that reporting misconduct was professional duty rather than betrayal. But the message remained consistent. Individual courage was the foundation of institutional integrity. Her secure phone contained hundreds of messages from soldiers across the military who'd found the strength to report misconduct because Kelly's story had shown them that victims could triumph over systems designed to silence them. Each message represented another life saved from the kind of institutional betrayal that had nearly destroyed her faith in service. The statistical reports were encouraging. Sexual assault complaints were being processed through independent oversight channels. Conviction rates had increased by 67%. Most importantly, victim satisfaction surveys showed restored confidence in military justice systems. But numbers couldn't capture the human cost of Collins's conspiracy or the ongoing struggle to repair institutional trust. Kelly carried letters from family members of soldiers who'd committed suicide rather than face careers destroyed by false accusations, from victims who'd left military service permanently damaged by institutional betrayal, from commanders who'd lost faith in their ability to protect the personnel under their authority. Reform was messy, imperfect, ongoing work that required constant vigilance against people who would exploit any system for personal advantage. But it was necessary work, the kind of unsexy institutional maintenance that determined whether democracy's guardians remained worthy of the trust placed in them. Standing in the Fort Braxton cafeteria that had become her unlikely monument, Kelly reflected on the journey that had transformed her from loyal soldier to institutional revolutionary. The plaque at table 14 bore a simple inscription: 14/27/33. When honor chose justice. Visitors often asked what the timestamp meant. Kelly's answer had evolved over 6 months of explaining her story to audiences who needed to understand that individual courage could reshape institutional culture. It means, she would say, that some moments define everything that comes after. That sometimes protecting an institution requires tearing it apart and rebuilding it from the foundation up. That honor isn't about following orders. It's about choosing justice, even when justice costs everything you thought you wanted. The military she served today was different from the one she'd joined 8 years earlier. Harder in some ways, because accountability demanded constant effort. Easier in others, because personnel no longer had to choose between institutional loyalty and moral integrity. Kelly Martinez had enlisted to serve her country. She'd discovered that sometimes serving your country meant fighting the institutions that claimed to represent it. That sometimes the most patriotic act was refusing to accept that systemic abuse was the price of national security. The timestamp 14/27/33 would forever remind future generations that honor and convenience were not interchangeable. That institutional survival could not justify individual sacrifice. And that sometimes the most important battles were fought not against foreign enemies, but against domestic corruption that threatened the values military service was meant to protect. In conference rooms across the Pentagon, in training facilities around the world, in congressional hearings that continued to refine military justice reforms, Kelly's story served as proof that individual soldiers possessed the power to reshape institutional culture when they chose courage over comfort, justice over convenience, honor over orders. The war was over. Honor had won, and the victory would endure as long as people remembered that institutions existed to serve justice, not the other way around.
You are not alone. Someone wants to hear you. Share your story. Thank you for watching to the end. Please like and subscribe to Stereo.